This story is not a story about drugs. This is a story about politics and a story about poverty.
You're listening to World Reframed. We're going to be talking today about Latin America and particularly about Venezuela and its relationships with the US. What the drug trade is, how it works, and why it doesn't matter to this story. I'm here with Alfie Panel. He's Associate Editor of Latin America Reports, and he's a freelance journalist who lives in Colombia. He spent a lot of time in the area talking to people, investigating this story in particular about Trump's campaign against what he sees as the drug cartels of Venezuela and their leader, which he says is Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. So, Alfie, thank you very much for joining us. First of all, you say this story is not about drugs. But drugs is a big thing, isn't it? Can you tell us a little bit about the relationship with drugs and the economies and the countries where you are primarily living and working?
So, Colombia is and has for a long time been the world's largest producer and exporter of cocaine. It's estimated that around 80% of the world's cocaine is produced within Colombia's borders. For years, for decades, the United States has made drug policy a focus of its foreign policy. The war on drugs, as it's been termed, has tried to militarize drug control. It's tried to target the supply of drugs through military action to try to cut off the drug trade at an international level. It's failed, and it's failed because the supply of drugs has not decreased in the 50 years of the war on drugs. We've seen some shifts in US drug policy, especially in recent years. There hasn't been as much of a fixation on this kind of military intervention in Colombia, which was a big fixture of the early 2000s. But what's happening under the Trump administration seems to be a return to this old idea that through military force, through unilateral action, there is a way to stem the drug trade. Now, in Colombia, it's important to note that the drug trade is incredibly complex, and it is sort of splintered in the past decade or so, where instead of having one group, one organization, a transnational criminal organization, which controls the supply chain throughout, what we have essentially is individual organizations or actors, criminal actors, who control a specific portion of the supply chain. So that could be coca cultivation. The coca crop produces the key ingredient for cocaine. You can't have cocaine without this crop. It could be the creation of coca, the pasta básica, the coca paste, which essentially is coca leaves soaked in petroleum with other chemicals added. Now that then is sold on to international buyers who refine it, and that's an incredibly technical process to convert the coca paste into refined cocaine. And then there are more kind of stages in the supply to get it all the way to North America. What we know is that Mexican criminal organizations, Mexican cartels, are highly involved in the Colombian cocaine trade. There is the presence of Mexican buyers within Colombian borders to sort of guarantee the safety of the product throughout. So if something happens to the product, the Mexicans have a man on the ground who's being risked. So sort of a way to kind of know that there's trust throughout. But essentially what's happening is this fragmentation of the supply chain. And the effect of that is not only that it's much harder to combat the drug production or the kind of the drug market, because there are so many different actors involved. So it's not that you can just cut off the head of the organization and then the rest of the kind of supply chain collapses. The other very interesting, very notable part of this, which has kind of explained what we've seen as a rise in violence related to criminal organizations in Latin America in recent years, is that at each point of the supply chain is now contested between warring criminal groups. And this is part of the reason for what's being described as kind of a resurgent conflict, internal armed conflict in Colombia. These tend to be happening in drug production areas and in border areas where there are warring armed groups, some of them sort of remnants of leftist guerrilla groups, and they're fighting for control over these economies, which are massively lucrative. They're selling cocaine for guns, and this is fueling an incredibly vicious internal armed conflict. So what we have is really quite a complex situation where the cocaine trade is intimately linked with all sorts of other kind of criminal activities, including mining, including smuggling, and it's fueling a massive wave of violence across the region.
Alfie, so how much is this affecting people's daily lives? How visible is this trade? Is it something which just goes on behind closed doors and you could easily not notice it? Or is it something that actually, if you go out into the countryside, into these towns, everybody knows who's involved, everybody knows what's happening?
It depends where you are. If you're in a big city, you probably don't notice it. If you go to somewhere like Catatumbo, which is the largest coca growing area of the world, I was there in February this year. Pretty much all of the locals, the farmers there, are involved in coca growing. That's the most lucrative crop, and essentially it's an economic thing. They're not doing it because they're living a glamorous lifestyle. They're doing it because it's the crop that pays the most. So in certain areas of the country, the drug trade is incredibly visible, and there's no state presence.
And let's come back a little bit to this story. Just to remind everybody what's happening. Basically, the Trump administration has decided that it feels that this transport of drugs is killing people in America. I mean, I think the figure they cited was every drug boat that comes across kills 25,000 people. And that's a very, very contested figure. I say contested, it's probably um, rebutted and refuted. But they say that 25,000 people are killed because these drugs are coming into America, and therefore they say it's a legitimate target. We will bomb them out of the sea. And they've done that on a number of occasions. And there's been some, claims and counterclaims, which I don't want to get into today, about whether they're, trying to kill everybody on the ship and even, bombing those who are clinging onto the wreckage after the initial attack. But from your point of view, when you went down to these areas where these ships, often these bodies are washing up, right, and these ships are departing from. And what was it like down there? What did people think about this? Was it scaring them? Was it changing the way they live?
Well, first of all, I think there's an important kind of point to make, which is that cocaine is not killing people in the numbers that fentanyl is. Fentanyl is the real drug which is killing Americans, and so that distinction is very important. Colombia and Venezuela do not export fentanyl. That's coming from Mexico. To answer your question about the kind of the attitude on the ground in these areas, people are very used to and very aware that the drug trade happens. I was in the Guajira Peninsula, which is in the northeast of Colombia, near the border with Venezuela. It's controlled by indigenous groups, and there's almost no state presence, police or army there. It's pocked by coves. It's been a smuggling paradise for almost 100 years now. Before the drug trade even existed in Colombia, it was used to smuggle because of the natural geography. People there say, look, this whole area is a massive drug smuggling area, and it's not kind of surprising that's happening. They're used to that happening, and the attitude is very much, that these attacks aren't really changing anything. That the people who want to smuggle drugs are smuggling drugs, and fishermen are fishing. But the fact is, yeah, it's really a kind of a part of life there, and there's no. There've been quite a lot of stories in the media of fishermen, being too afraid to go out fishing. I didn't meet anybody who told me that. Everybody who I met who was an honest fisherman said, "No, I'm not. I'm not scared to go out. I'm not a drug smuggler. I don't go that far out to sea. I don't go into international waters. We only fish in Colombian waters." So the attitude is kind of, that they're not really affected by what's happening. A lot of them were skeptical of whether this Colombian fisherman, who the president has said was a fisherman and his family have said was a fisherman, whether he was or wasn't a fisherman. There's no way to know. But I think that brings us to an important point, which is that the US government hasn't provided evidence as to whether he was or wasn't a drug trafficker. So the real problem here is that the United States government is executing people without evidence and without trial, and we don't know if he was a fisherman or wasn't a fisherman.
Okay, I'd go back to the point you made earlier about fentanyl, because we have a clip of the president of the National Assembly talking about that of Venezuela. Let's just hear that now.
Empezando que el principal problema de dependencia en los Estados Unidos en este momento.
The opioid epidemic in the United States of America is owed, the United States of America owes it to the big pharmaceutical companies that throughout the 90s sold opiates, sold codeine without any type of control, saying that it caused no form of dependency. If they want to bomb something, bomb the headquarters of Purdue Pharma.
Quieren bombardear algo, bombardeen la sede de Purdue Pharma.
So, Alfie, that's obviously, there's a lot of anger coming from the administration down in Venezuela. Are people on the ground angry about this, and who do they blame? Do they blame the drugs gangs? Do they blame the governments? Or do they blame the Americans?
So I think, yeah, generally, people are a bit shocked by what's happened. I think by the fact that there is a chance that an innocent fisherman was kind of exploded in a boat bomb. But I think there's kind of also a lot of Colombians do support the kind of action of Trump, which is taking a tough stance on drugs. A lot of people's lives have been ruined by the drug trade. And so there is, especially on the coast, there are a lot of people who are quite conservative and take quite a conservative kind of stance on. They want to see, an iron fist against the drug trade. So it's quite split. And people who are honest, hardworking fishermen, they don't feel threatened by what's happening. And so the kind of life goes on. That's what they tell me. Life goes on. Not much has changed. This for them is kind of something that's happening far away. On a geopolitical scale, and really, in terms of the day-to-day impact, it's minimal.
And if we listen to what President Maduro would say about this, obviously Trump calls him the drug dealer in chief and says he's the head of the gangs which are responsible for this. He says, and we have a clip of this now, that his police force is doing an excellent job. They're very professional. They've wiped out the crime gangs in Venezuela.
Se debe saber que Venezuela ha construido un sistema policial.
Venezuela has built a professional, scientific, and exemplary police force, a model we are ready to share with neighboring countries through cooperation agreements for information exchange and joint operations. We have confronted and dismantled every major criminal gang in the country.
So, who's right, Alfie? Who's telling the truth here?
So, it's the Maduro government definitely has some involvement in the drug trade, of course. But this idea of the cartel of the Suns, which the Trump organization claims Maduro is heading, it's a bit of an exaggeration, I think, and it's not when you hear cartel, you picture this kind of organized structure taking orders from the top, where Maduro is controlling the drug trade. That's not the case. There are known links between the government, the Venezuelan government, and transnational crime organizations. For example, the Colombian National Liberation Army, which has been known to work for the Venezuelan government as a paramilitary force defending gold mines in the jungle and the border area near Colombia. Now that group is massively involved in the cocaine trade, for example in Catatumbo. So there are definitely links between the Venezuelan government and the drug trade, but that's not to say that necessarily the Venezuelan government is commanding a drug organization. It's more a case where it's an incredibly corrupt state, and of course in these rural areas there will be local officials, governors who are kind of taking bribes or working alongside, taking their cut from this trade. And yeah, there are these links. But the fact is, it's not about drugs. And if the Trump administration did care about drugs, it wouldn't have pardoned the ex-Honduran president, Orlando Hernandez, last week or 2 weeks ago. That shows that they don't really care about whether a leader is involved in the drug trade. That there are strong evidence that this Honduran leader was up to his neck in the drug trade. He was
But he's convicted, right? I mean,
convicted in the US. He was serving over 20-year, I can't remember exactly, I think it was 24-year sentence, and Trump pardoned him. So I think that underscores the kind of the reality here, which is that the issue is not that Maduro may or may not be involved in the drug trade. The issue is that Maduro is seen as an ideological foe of this administration.
so let's get to that point then, which is really the heart of this issue. The U.S. governments and various U.S. governments have had a view more or less explicitly expressed that they wanted to throw out the socialist governments of Venezuela for decades, right? Since Hugo Chavez, and especially since some of the elections where the opposition candidates looked to have won, and then those results got challenged or overturned. Are we at a time now where that idea of a regime change in Venezuela looks closer than it has before, or is the government there actually in quite a strong position still?
It's hard to say kind of what that regime change would look like. Maduro has offered to resign. That's been clear. In a call with Trump, he offered to step down in favor of his vice president, Delcy Rodriguez. Now, is that regime change? That's still kind of the cabal that's been running Venezuela for the past over 20 years remaining in power. So does regime change entail an end to the current kind of political group which is in power? Does it entail an end to the military and kind of a complete change in military staff? Removal of all the top generals who are intimately tied to the Maduro regime. It's an incredibly kind of complex feat to change what is. They've essentially, what's happened in Venezuela is they've hollowed out the state, and what you have is a kleptocracy of kind of a few members of the elite political class who are incredibly wealthy and derive their legitimacy from the military. So it's not just a case of Maduro resigning. It would require a lot more than that. And what that looks like, it's hard to say how close or how feasible that is. I think this is definitely the most pressure we've seen on Venezuela in a long time, probably since Chavez came to power. Most pressure by the US. I think the presence of such a large military force off the coast of Venezuela is also troubling and kind of suggests that Trump is trying to pressure the regime. But whether that is going to materialize into any kind of concrete effects in terms of shift in power in Venezuela, that's still, I think, a long way to be seen.
And obviously the government in Colombia has been quite supportive of its neighbours this time, which isn't always the case. How far does that support go? Is that just a case of showing that they will stand up to Trump, or do you think that there's a genuine desire there to make sure that this American imperialism doesn't come and start changing the way that politics works in Latin America?
So I think it's important to note that in the elections last year, which were widely kind of deemed fraudulent, Colombia's president Petro also did not recognize Maduro's legitimacy. So Petro has acknowledged that Maduro is not the legitimate leader of Venezuela. However, he's also clear that the US should not be allowed to intervene in the way that it has. And Petro has more taken issue with the boat issue, which he sees as a grave kind of violation of human rights. And I think that's really where he takes issue. But of course, he's a kind of a leftist president, and he's a former guerrilla fighter. So this is his bread and butter, this kind of rhetoric of anti-imperialism, especially in relation to the United States in Latin America. And he's found his battle. In many ways, it's served him well. It's kind of given him what he's wanted, and that's what we're seeing play out. Whether or not Petro would help Maduro if the US were to attack Venezuela, I think that's hard to say. The military definitely wouldn't get involved because any military action would require approval from Congress, which is a much more kind of conservative, kind of centrist and center-right than the ruling coalition, and it's a minority coalition. So, yeah, I don't think we should expect that much. The support is mostly rhetorical.
Alfie, thank you so much for unwrapping this for us. It's a very deep issue. If people want to hear more from you, where can they find out more?
They can follow me on Twitter at Panel Alfie, or on LinkedIn as well.
Thank you very much. This has been World Reframed. We'll be back next week.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.